Well, since U.S. President Donald Trump raised the aluminum tariffs to 50% in June, Canada has been shifting its aluminum exports to other parts of the world. My next guest says this high-level tariff on aluminum is simply not sustainable.
It is one of the most widely used metals on Earth.
Global demand for this resource, which is significant today and going to be much more significant in the months and years ahead. And to have a third of the relative to the global reserves, to have a third of that resource present right here in Saskatchewan, that's a significant discussion.
A 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
Canada has taken a decisive step that few in Washington fully anticipated, and the consequences are now moving straight through the core of American manufacturing. What once appeared to be a stable and deeply integrated supply relationship has shifted quickly, creating ripple effects across cost production strategies and global trade positioning. This is not simply a short-term disruption or a political disagreement. It represents a structural change in how a critical industrial material flows across borders. And the implications are far more serious than they first appeared. For decades, Canada has been the dominant supplier of aluminum to the United States. At its peak, it provided roughly 50 to 60% of all primary aluminum consumed in the American economy. That level of dependence was not symbolic. It was deeply embedded in the way industries operated. Aluminum from Canada was present in automobiles, aircraft construction systems, packaging, and electronics. It moved efficiently across the border, supported by geography and infrastructure and long-standing trade agreements. Over time, this relationship became so reliable that many businesses stopped viewing it as a risk altogether. Because of that reliability, American manufacturers built their operations around consistent access to Canadian aluminum. Supply chains were designed for efficiency, not redundancy. Costs were calculated based on predictable import flows. Long-term contracts and production strategies assumed that this pipeline would remain open and stable. In many ways, Canadian aluminum became an invisible but essential component of the U.S. industrial system. That assumption began to unravel when the United States introduced tariffs on Canadian aluminum. Initially imposed in 2018 and later revisited and expanded, these measures were framed as a way to protect domestic production. The idea was that limiting imports would give American producers space to grow and compete. However, the reality turned out to be far more complex and in many ways counterproductive. Canada did not passively accept reduced access to its largest market. Instead, it responded strategically. Faced with tariffs and uncertainty, Canadian producers began looking for alternative buyers. Europe quickly emerged as the most viable destination. Existing trade agreements between Canada and the European Union provided a foundation for smoother transactions, making it easier to redirect exports. Without facing the same barriers imposed by the United States, this shift didn't happen slowly. A substantial portion of Canadian aluminum that once flowed into American markets began moving toward Europe. Reports suggest that a large share of this redirected supply is now being absorbed by European buyers. What makes this particularly significant is that it is not a temporary adjustment. It is a long-term realignment of trade routes that had remained stable for decades. One of the reasons Canada was able to pivot so effectively lies in the structure of its aluminum industry.
Much of its production is concentrated in Quebec, where hydroelectric power provides a steady and relatively low-cost source of energy.
Since aluminum smelting requires enormous amounts of electricity, this gives Canadian producers a major advantage. In addition to being cost-efficient, Canadian aluminum is also produced with a lower carbon footprint compared to many global competitors. This environmental factor has become increasingly important in recent years. European industries, particularly in automotive and aerospace sectors, are under growing pressure to reduce emissions throughout their supply chains. Using low-carbon materials is one of the most effective ways to meet these targets. Canadian aluminum fits perfectly into this strategy, making it highly attractive to European buyers. As a result, Europe did not just accept Canadian supply. It actively integrated it into its industrial framework. While Canada strengthens its position in Europe, the United States faces a significant structural challenge. Domestic aluminum production has been declining for decades. At one point, the country had dozens of operational smelters. Today, only a handful remain active, and they produce a fraction of what is needed to meet national demand. This means that the U.S. has long relied on imports to fill the gap. Canada was the most logical source. due to its proximity, cost efficiency, and reliability. With that supply now being partially redirected, American manufacturers must turn to other regions. However, the global aluminum market is not easy to navigate. China dominates production, but importing from China involves tariffs, geopolitical risks, and logistical complications. Other suppliers, such as those in the Middle East, can provide material, but often at higher costs and with longer delivery times. The result is a clear increase in input costs for American manufacturers. Aluminum is a critical material that cannot easily be substituted, and as price rises, companies are forced to make difficult decisions. Some pass the costs on to consumers, leading to higher prices for finished goods. Others absorb the costs, which reduces profitability. In more challenging situations, businesses begin to rethink their operations entirely. These adjustments often happen gradually. Companies may delay expansion plans, reduce hiring, or invest more heavily in automation to control costs. In some cases, they may consider relocating production to regions where raw materials are more accessible and affordable. These decisions are rarely dramatic. But over time, they accumulate and reshape the industrial landscape. Certain industries are particularly exposed to these changes. The automotive sector is one of the most affected. Modern vehicles rely heavily on aluminum to reduce weight and improve efficiency, especially in electric vehicles where battery performance is critical. A sustained increase in aluminum costs directly impacts production economics and pricing strategies. The aerospace industry faces similar pressures. Aircraft manufacturing depends on specialized aluminum alloys, and supply chain stability is essential. Any disruption in availability or pricing adds the complexity to an already demanding process. Companies in this sector must carefully manage sourcing strategies to avoid delays and cost overruns. The impact does not stop at the factory level. It extends into regional economies, particularly in areas with strong manufacturing bases. States that rely heavily on industrial activity are especially vulnerable to rising input costs. When companies face financial pressure, they often respond by slowing hiring, reducing investment, or optimizing operations. Over time, these changes can affect employment levels and economic growth. One of the most important aspects of the situation is the gap between policy intent and actual outcomes. The tariffs were designed to protect domestic aluminum producers, but the limited size of that industry means the benefits are concentrated among a small number of firms. The costs are spread across a much larger group of manufacturers that depend on aluminum as an input. In effect, the policy has created a situation where downstream industries bear the burden of higher costs without a corresponding increase in domestic supply. This imbalance makes it difficult to achieve the original goal of strengthening American production capacity. Rebuilding the domestic aluminum industry is often suggested as a solution, but it is not a simple process. Constructing new smelters requires billions of dollars in investment, access to low-cost energy, and years of development. It also depends on a stable policy environment that encourages long-term investment. Without these conditions, larger-scale expansion remains unlikely in the near future. Meanwhile, Europe continues to strengthen its position of securing access to Canadian aluminum. This provides European manufacturers with a reliable and cost-effective supply of a critical material. It also supports their efforts to reduce carbon emissions, giving them an additional competitive advantage in global markets. For consumers, the effects of these changes are gradual but noticeable over time. Aluminum is present in a wide range of everyday products, from vehicles and appliances to packaging and electronics. At a strategic level, Canada's decision to redirect its exports demonstrates its ability to adapt and diversify. It shows that the country is not dependent on a single market and can respond effectively to changing conditions. This strengthens its negotiating position and alters the balance of its economic relationship with the United States. Trade relationships depend on trust and predictability. When those elements are disrupted, rebuilding them takes time. Even if tariffs were removed quickly, the new connections Canada has established with European buyers would not disappear overnight. Supply chains tend to stabilize once they are reconfigured, making reversals slow and uncertain. For the United States, this creates a more complex and challenging environment. It faces higher costs, reduced flexibility. It will involve long-term planning, investment, and a reassessment of how supply chains are structured. Ultimately, what's unfolding is not just a reaction to tariffs.